Paratroopers were some of the most important, impactful, and badass troops of World War II who played a pivotal role in the outcome of the war. And the boots that they wore were allegedly the best boots of any soldier in any army, cementing the legacy of the paratroopers and their boots in the pages of history forever. So what is a paratrooper and what made their boots so good? Well, paratroopers are pretty obviously soldiers who jump out of airplanes using parachutes, often in a forced entry strategy, where militaries would use this by dropping their troops behind enemy lines to disrupt supply lines, hit high priority targets, disrupt and confuse enemy strategy to great effect, especially in World War II. But even though parachutes were invented in 1783 by Frenchman Louis Sebastien Lenormand by jumping off a building with essentially an oversized umbrella, and also he coined the term parachute by combining the word para meaning against and shoot meaning fall, the first known airborne commando operation didn't happen until well over 100 years later in 1916 when a lieutenant of the Prussian army was set behind enemy lines to destroy railroad tracks to great effect. And this was clearly an effective military strategy that hadn't been utilized until this time because airplanes just hadn't really been invented and there was no way to get troops up into the air in an effective way to drop them down on enemy troops. To put it in perspective, just a few years previous, the Wright brothers were the first to achieve sustained flight by a manned, heavier than air powered and controlled aircraft in Kitty Hawk on December 17th of 1903. So in just 13 years, people went from thinking manned flight was completely impossible to dropping soldiers behind enemy lines to destroy infrastructure. Then from 1916 to 1930, huge leaps took place in the development of airplanes and parachutes that took paratroopers from this small strike team attack to a full-fledged military strategy, with Italy in 1930 becoming the first country to found an airborne force branch of the military, quickly followed by Germany and the Soviet Union as they inched closer and closer to World War II. Skip to 1940 when the German army used a new military strategy called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war in English, where they used surprise attacks to rapidly overwhelm an opponent's defenses by land, sea, and most importantly for this video, air. And this strategy was deadly effective, and each military was basically forced to deal with this new threat of dropping enemies from the sky. And leading up to the US involvement in World War II, the American standard issue boot was basically the same boot that we cut apart from the World War I video, with just a short little 6-inch leather boot. So in 1941, William P. Yarborough becomes a test officer designing the airborne uniform, including the boots, which he found these lower boots previously did not provide enough ankle stability for these kinds of landings. So William went to work designing the perfect paratrooper boot by upgrading the durability, the support, the grip, and the longevity. And on June 5th, 1944, his boot would be put to the ultimate test as 13,000 American paratroopers boarded C-47 airplanes in preparations for the largest airborne operation in history. The next day, June 6, 1944, D-Day, 73,000 US soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, including those 13,000 paratroopers clad in their newly designed jump boots, camel, facial war paint, and in the words of Eisenhower, who met them the night before, the light of battle was in their eyes. But problems began immediately as they crossed into France, encountering a large cloud bank over the peninsula where most pilots either had to climb or dive through and avoid anti-aircraft fire, further dispersing the fleet. And in the resulting chaos, the air crews dropped their paratroopers far away from their intended drop zones. And despite all those issues and being dropped in trees and landing in swamps, the paratroopers would be key to the success of D-Day, one of the most devastating and deadliest operations of the war, where nearly 2,500 paratroopers were lost in the first day of the D-Day invasion, showing how dangerous but effective paratroopers could be. And American paratroopers quickly became notorious and invaluable during the great campaigns of World War II and were often considered to be the best trained and toughest soldiers in the military. And these boots quickly became a symbol of the paratroopers and were highly sought after because of their superior quality. And paratroopers quickly became as attached to their boots as they were to their rifles. So much so that in 1945, when these boots were supposed to be replaced by the M43 boots that we cut apart with the double buckle that wraps around, the paratroopers basically all rejected that and refused to use them because the buckles would get tangled in the parachute equipment and the lines. They were bulkier, they were heavier. They basically flat out refused to use them, and the Air Corps finally relented and they were allowed to use their old jump boots for the rest of the war, cementing the reputation of the paratroopers and the boots that they wore as some of the greatest soldiers and boots of World War II, to a point where it's such an iconic silhouette that you can still buy a jump boot from several different brands and several different qualities that can still be worn with dress uniforms to this day, 80 plus years later. But first, what is this boot? Well, the brand is the Endicott Johnson. The style is the jump boot. They weigh 1 pound 12 ounces. They retailed, well, at least we bought them on eBay for $179. They're made in the USA. And if you want a pair of these, we'll put some links to some more modern jump boots and some of the ones we reviewed in the description. So let's start looking at materials, starting with the leather first. So how thick is this leather? It's 2.3 millimeters thick. So it's gonna be more durable, more supportive for those hard landings. It's gonna last longer without splitting and cracking. It's gonna be less prone to failure. It's also a 10-inch boot so that they could tuck their pants in so it wasn't flapping in the wind and there was less things to catch on the parachute. And it also gave them more support and more protection when they landed on those hard landings, because those old parachutes are barely parachutes compared to modern parachutes. You didn't have nearly as much control, and so a lot of times you'd land in trees, land in swamps, land in thick brush where you needed the protection of a taller boot. The tongue is also gusseted pretty high to keep junk out of your boot. It has a toe cap, which is one of the iconic parts of the jump boot, and this is just a double layer of leather to help prevent wearing through the boots through the toe when you're kneeling and crawling around, especially when you're a paratrooper where you don't have access to repairs and don't have access to brand new boots if you wear yours out. The leather is also really interesting because it's a heavily pigmented leather. It has a top coat of this like reddish brown, basically paint on top. And this helped make the boots more water resistant, because if you remember the other World War II and World War I boots that we reviewed, they're usually the flesh out, and that flesh out is basically a sponge for water. So having a heavily pigmented grain out leather was really different from any other boots the US military had. But all this thick leather and all these attributes made these boots really, really tough to break in. And if we go to the inside of the boot, looking at the lining, it's completely unlined all the way through the boot. There's no lining in the vamp. And part of the reason they did this is probably because they wanted a faster drying boot, they wanted less fell points, they wanted it easier to make so they could produce more of these boots for more soldiers. And going even deeper into the boot, you can see that there is a half sock liner at the heel, and it has a full-length leather insole. It breaks into the shape of your foot, giving you additional comfort. It doesn't smell as much, it doesn't mold nearly as much, and that same really thick leather is also all through the midsole, because you have a full-length leather midsole as well. Then if you look at the outsole, this is a rubber outsole, where a lot of previous military boots, especially in World War I, were just leather soles. And they were so slippery that they literally had to put nails into the bottom of the sole, called hobnails, to give soldiers any kind of grip. But as rubber slowly became better, cheaper, and faster to produce, it became pretty clear that it was the material of choice for sole material. And depending on this version, they either had anything from a full sole like this to a half sole with a rubber top lift, which made these boots grip better, last longer, made them more comfortable, more water resistant, and they don't have a full leather heel stack like we've seen in some of the other World War II boots, where that full leather heel stack, they're awesome, they look cool, but for war times when you need durability and reliability, especially for these troops behind enemy lines, they basically had to do a rubber heel because it's not going to absorb nearly as much water, it's less prone to failure, the leather's not going to get waterlogged and rot and fall apart. And one of the coolest things about this boot is the way it's built and the redundancy baked into this specific boot compared to even the other World War II boots. It's a 270 Goodyear welt construction, one of the most durable and time-tested ways of making a boot, especially for this era, because Goodyear welts in this time were not sewn to a canvas skimming, it was actually sewn directly into the insole. So you have a stitch that sews through the upper to the insole, and then that stitch also sews down to the midsole, and on this boot all the way to the outsole, sewing all those layers together. But the crazy part, it's also a nailed construction, because you can see all these nails, these brass nails that go all the way around the boot, are doing the exact same thing the Goodyear welt is doing by clinching together the outsole, the midsole, and the upper, but just with nails. And it's a very common way of making boots at the time, but usually you only see either a Goodyear welt or a nailed construction. This boot just happens to have two. It's like they built this boot twice. It's double redundant, it's double durable. If the stitching fails, you still have the nails. If the nails fail, you still have the stitching. So now let's cut these things in half and I'll show you how all those nails clinch over and all the construction and all the things on the inside that made these arguably the best boots of World War II. And we just launched the African Trooper that we pulled a ton of inspiration from, obviously the jump boot, the Paratrooper boot, African Trooper. Clearly toe cap, the paneling, the whole aesthetic of it all. But this is an attempt at honestly the very first heritage barefoot boot, where you have all those barefoot attributes, the wide toe box, the zero drop, ridiculous flexibility, all while still looking somewhat like the Paratrooper boot. And on the inside, if you haven't watched this video, go watch it, but a quick rundown, zero lining, just like these Paratrooper boots, that leather insole, and built under the same idea of the Paratrooper boot to be super durable, reliable, combining those heritage attributes with those barefoot attributes with the Paratrooper styling to make the African Trooper boot. So if you're interested in this, go check those out. The links in my description, the cut in half videos and the links, the unboxing, all the information, sizing is below. So check out the African Trooper that we collaborated with Jim Green on, be links in the description. And thanks again to Jim Green for being willing to do this product with us and launch this collaboration. Limited quantities, links below. I think that's probably good. All right, we got them cut in half, and not only are these the stinkiest kinds of boots to cut in half, but they're also the most painful because it is a historical boot and it's lasted for almost 100 years, especially when you can actually see the footprint of the people that wore these boots almost 100 years ago. So thank you guys for your support and helping us attempt to immortalize these things that slowly just kind of drift into obscurity. So, and if you're not subscribed, consider doing it because that's the only way we're able to do this. So now, let's see what's inside. Now you can really see all those nails that I was showing you, these brass nails from the outside, and how they clinch all these layers together in the same way that that Goodyear welt stitch does. And so that's what I meant by basically a double built boot. It has two different ways of making a boot built into a single boot. It seems like it's as simple as possible while still serving that function and being as durable as possible, because you don't have that lining. You don't have a lot of the little teeny features that don't necessarily matter when it comes to a warfare boot. But all the important parts that make this boot what it is, they're extra redundant and they're over the top, they're extra thick, like all the things that we talked about with the nail construction and the Goodyear welt. The really thick insole, the leather midsole, this really thick heel counter, the steel shank, because this boot was specifically built for soldiers who were dropped behind enemy lines, and it had to be as fail-proof as humanly possible. So then why were these boots considered the best boots of World War II? Why were they so highly sought after, and why did the paratroopers refuse to use anything other than their jump boots? Well, all boots made for war are made to be tough, but there's no other troops that rely on their boots and depend on their boots like the badass dudes jumping out of planes with parachutes, dodging shrapnel, dodging the shooting gallery as they're slowly floating down and the Germans are trying to pick them out of the sky, and landing in enemy territory. They had to have the best boots the US was capable of making for war, and that's exactly what these are. The toughest boots of World War II, made for the toughest dudes of World War II, to a point where if this boot was made like this today, it would still be one of the toughest and highest quality boots that you could buy almost 100 years later. So thanks for watching this, and let me know what you think, and I'll put a big list of all the other historical World War I, World War II, Korean, Vietnam boots that we've cut apart in the description, so you can go watch more of these, and let me know what other military boot you want us to cut in half next. And thank you guys for supporting this channel and subscribing, and our Rose Anvil 2 channel, and our handmade leather goods that we make here in the shop that make all this possible. So thank you guys. See ya. Yeah. You everywhere. What? Okay. I'm tired. And what?